hello to all of you. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us for the first forum here on stage 2. The Green Energy Forum is an incredibly broad title, for which I apologise for, but it also gives us great scope to dig into all kinds of different areas. And as with all of these panels, I want all of you to join in. So, frankly, the least I say, the better. But we'll start with an obvious one to begin with, and it's going to be a really common theme that comes up with a lot of our panels, firesides, and keynotes over the next 2 days. And that is how the policymakers, the governments, the decision makers, the people who actually control the switches to make a lot of these things happen, how can businesses and governments work together to accelerate the move to green and renewable energy sources? David, I'll start with you because your name is first on my list. For you, what do you feel they can do differently and more of to try and make this change?
I think engagement's key with business. Governments on their own are not going to solve the problem for the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. Businesses, especially tech businesses, have access to pretty significant funds by developing items such as PPAs. That helps build more capacity, but that's doing that without. I think there's 2 benefits to it. One, you're helping to create more renewable sources, and secondly, you're reducing your consumption from the grid that's there already. So, but the key thing for me with all these things, it's about education, because they only know what they know, and we're involved in a lot of things like Tech UK, etc. So we speak to the government a lot all of the time, and the carousel of ministers that we have at the moment, I think, is also a bit problematic, where you've got people in position for weeks at a time.
John, I'll pass that to you next.
So I think one of the key things that government can help us with is consistency in messaging and direction. So I'm in the heat sector, decarbonising heat, predominantly via district heating networks, and increasingly what we're now seeing from government is actually a recognition that this is a key solution in decarbonising the heating sector in the UK. Heating makes up about 1/3 of UK carbon emissions, and so there's a huge amount of work to be done in this space. And with the energy bill going through Parliament at the moment, we're actually starting to see a recognition of what needs to be done in terms of regulation of the sector, but also new powers for heat network operators, and a range of other things like heat network zoning coming in. But actually, in terms of the long-term consistency, showing the market and the supply chain in particular the direction of travel, and that actually it's worth their while and their investment pounds being directed towards a given sector, whether it be wind or onshore wind. It's been quite a bit in the news recently, but equally things like district heating and heat pumps. Clarity about the ongoing support, but also the regulatory environment and other restrictions around things like planning and so on, in the longer term, can actually really help for industry to pivot towards providing solutions in these sectors.
Yeah, so we've had collaboration, we've had consistency. Viviana, if you've got something that begins with a C, I'd be very impressed.
Yeah, okay. I think my point would be on when the governments should know when not to intervene. And I think we saw a lot of knee-jerk reactions after the energy crisis last year, which were ultimately not that helpful and creates a lot of political instability and political risk in the terms of these long-term contracts especially. And the PPA market is now at a maturity level where actually it can function on its own without a lot of government help. So close collaboration, engagement, education, and really understanding where the market is at is really important, so that the governments can actually allow the market to do what it's designed to do, which is to grow. And so that's where we try to support as well through the exchange.
Yeah, so it's knowing when not to jump in. And Stephen, same question to you.
Oh, I've got some C's for you. How about control and capacity?
Don't add too many, I won't remember them.
Yeah. So the first that we found in our work in clean energy cities is that as decarbonization of the energy system happens, it decentralizes. And that means that central government need to give up control. They need to actually try to say, we cannot be trying to control this all ourselves with a dispatchable energy system, with green solar farms and wind farms that are out there. I mean, for every gigawatt of capacity, now we have 50 gigawatts in the UK, you have to add about 3 billion of reinforcement costs if you're going to have a centralized system of just pumping it all into cities. So giving up control and giving capacity to local governments and to businesses in the built environment to actually deliver local generation and storage, to not have those huge costs like put onto everyone's energy bills, including businesses and all residents. That control needs to give up, and I don't see the UK government giving up that control really kind of easily right now. And because that is I used to work in central government, so I've seen it from the inside of how difficult it is to give up that centralized control to local government. So those are the kinds of things that I need to see happen to be able to deliver local energy systems that are really decarbonized in the future.
Yeah, some excellent insights there into what could be done to actually make those changes. But I've got another C for you, and that is challenges. Because with all of these things, we know increasing the use of green energy is something everyone wants to get to. But what are the key challenges that we need to overcome to really scale up that green energy usage? And I'll put that out to all of you to pick up from, really. And what are the key challenges we need to overcome to scale up green energy usage?
I think in our industry, one big challenge is resilience. So we deliver services that can never be off. So historically, the backup to the primary energy source has been through self-generation, typically through diesel, which obviously is not particularly green. And the technology now is there to replace that, but it doesn't work at scale. And so it's getting better, but in an ideal world, we need a different configuration. It might just not be technology, it might be the way in which we use the services that we provide. So can we provide that robustness without the need for non-green technology?
I think from my side, the key challenge in the sector I operate in, Vattenfall is developing heat networks in a number of UK cities and operates heat networks across the continent, places like Amsterdam and Berlin. And to reach the scale that we need to decarbonise heating in the UK, we've got to go from 2% of heat being delivered by district heating through to 20%. So that's a tenfold increase. And currently the supply chain skills and frankly the understanding of the technology isn't available. And so there's a huge amount for government to do, but also in partnership with local authorities to again provide that clarity of direction that actually this is happening and this is something that we should be pivoting towards as supply chain in general. And at a more local level, and particularly, for example, in the work we're doing in Bristol with the local authority as part of the City Leap project, which is a kind of more all-encompassing decarbonisation plan for Bristol, is working with local colleges, local universities, other skills organisations, the combined authority with the neighbouring authorities, to actually plan for the skills of the future that we're going to need over the next 20 to 30 years to decarbonise a city at scale via a number of things, including district heating, but across the whole energy sector.
Does it almost need to be a situation where there's really good case studies of a city genuinely leading the way to show others? Would that be a key driver for you?
I think those case studies are emerging. I think that we haven't necessarily had the amount of time it takes to fully implement them, but certainly some of the examples I'm sure we'll hear about from other places in the continent, you bring these things together, you've got a full case study of the whole city, but actually these things are happening, and we can't. The other cities can't wait to look back at Bristol or other places in 10 or 20 years to go, well, we should have done that. We all need to be doing it right now.
Yeah, staying with those challenges.
Can I ask John a question?
Of course.
When you're saying we need to get at 20% district heat to get to net zero, whose work are you citing to say that we need to get to 20%?
So that's the Climate Change Committee
Okay.
in the UK, and it's the figure that the UK government has kind of not targeted, but it's kind of aligned with, in certainly from the Department of Energy Security, net zero is certainly aligned with that figure. I mean, in places like Bristol, the local analysis that's been commissioned by the city is pointing to something more in the region of 40 to 50% of buildings being connected to district heating in order to get to net zero. And part of that is a density thing, that actually, when you look at listed buildings, buildings in very dense environments where there aren't necessarily it's not necessarily possible to install other solutions. From a lowest cost, lowest carbon perspective, district heating is seen as one of the best options, but other options are going to be needed.
Yeah, so just returning to the challenges, if I come to you both.
Sure. So from the wholesale market perspective, again, it's a level of sophistication and maturity that I see needs to still happen. think there's a lot of demand for large utilities to keep on building renewables, but they need buyers. And for more PPAs to be signed, the buyers of the PPAs need to be able to enter into those contracts more quickly, more efficiently, with less cost. So higher standardization is needed as well. And there are a lot of startups around that are trying to enable that, which is very good. And also in terms of risk transfer, then this could bring these buyers a little closer to the wholesale market to use risk management products like the one that we offer, and therefore spread risk amongst more entities in the value chain, because the identification and allocation of risk is really a big obstacle in these PPAs as well. So that's something that we think we hope to see more of in the future.
I think I said before about capacity within local government, actually within the built environment sector as well, and sustainability leads for the property sector. But also the incentives of investments are all a mess at the moment. The incentives for somebody who's a landlord of a building that might be building renewables may not be the same as the tenant who's actually paying the energy bill or getting the reductions for that. So there's options that are available that aren't quite being legal and quite tested in finance here. You can tell I'm American. I'm quoting something from America, which is property-based finance, which is called abbreviates the PACE, which is essentially you can actually start to pay back the investment. Any future owner pays back the investment as in the future, which isn't really available right here. But the Green Finance Institute is trying to make a UK version of it to see if it works in the future. But there's also kind of local authority-based kind of in schemes such as Landology that will happen as well. But the incentives for investments, especially around the local generation and storage, and having that generation as close to demand as possible, so we don't have to spend that $3 billion per gigawatt that I quoted before, and also the connection problem is there as well. Like I won't try to talk down about data centers too much and the problems in London with connections that have been caused by data centers taking up the capacity, but the regulation around that is all a bit of a mess right now. It's first come, first serve, regardless of what the city's needs are for connection of renewables or connection of new buildings into the city. So it causes delays by a long time. And also the electricity systems operator, their formula for connections doesn't take flexibility into account. If I have the ability to turn down and turn up, so I'm using electricity peak demand and heating up the building in off-peak times and not asking for peak times, they don't take that into account right now. And so they need to be able to take that into account to increase the number of connections. If you've renewables being put on and it's part of and it's mostly being self-used in the buildings and it's not putting pressure on the network, the ESO formula that the DNO has put in place, they don't take it into account right now, which is scandalous in my opinion.
Can I just add something to that, which is, I think, someone else mentioned it, but collaboration, I think, is so key at a city level between all the key partners, because you talk about the local electricity network operator, and actually understanding what is planned in terms of decarbonisation at a household level, at a business level, and at a city level with the local authority and people like heat network operators, but other large-scale consumers of electricity. The process of actually planning local energy markets and local energy consumption across local authorities with all those parties is going to become increasingly important to avoid the issues that you're describing.
I want to move on about what everyone can do to move towards the use of green energy, because everyone would love their industry, manufacturer, home to use more green energy. But we've looked at some of the challenges, the things, the balance of risk. We've looked at reliability. How can we get more people to make that step? Is it something that needs to be incentivized? Is it an education problem? What more can be done to actually make people make that step? Because it needs lots of people to make the step for us to really see the impact, I suppose. That's quite a rambling question, but what can we actually do to make people make those commitments and make those steps?
In our industry, that demand very much is coming from customer. I mean, we're on board with it 100%, but most organisations now will have sustainability targets, and that will drive things like their energy procurement strategy.
Can I ask, has that changed a lot in recent years? Has that been a very quick evolution?
Very, very much so. I would say if you went back maybe 5 or 6 years, the key things that customers were looking for was much more, let's say, IT focused around reliability, around confidentiality of data, making sure that when you're looking after it, you're not going to, it's always going to be available and you're not going to be any loss. But sustainability now is we go through procurement exercises with customers, and there's big sections in the responses that we send back now that back in the day just weren't there at all. So it's very, very visible, and a key criteria, I think, when people are choosing who they do business with now.
But to sort of return to the question, what more can be done? You say it's very much customer driven.
Yeah, I think there's also again at government level, and you've got to link all this stuff together. Previously, when paying for your energy, there was incentives. So in the early days of renewable energy, it was more expensive than fossil based energy. But the government introduced things that they reduced paying some of the levies that you would pay on energy from fossil fuels. It's only a small thing, but it's an example of the way in which central instruction can drive behaviour.
I'll carry on that down the line. What else do you feel can be done?
Well, we've seen certain incentives coming in, cash incentives for things like installing air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, the boiler upgrade scheme, a good example of that. We've seen similar things in the EV space for charge points and for supporting the purchase of electric vehicles. Now, if you look at the pace of EV purchases as a percentage of overall car sales in the UK, it's starting to pick up that consumption, that adoption curve. It's really starting to accelerate, and I think we'll see the same thing with low carbon heating, a variety of types, including heat pumps, but also district heating. Once that understanding really starts to hit, and I think part of that, and there's organisations here, like for example Octopus, doing a great job of really simplifying the process. And so once you've got the funding support in place and there's consistency on a long-term basis, simplifying the process of actually decarbonising people's lives is a really important thing, because people, there's so much misinformation out there and lack of understanding, that cutting through that and just creating a straightforward, simple customer journey for people to use is a really, really key way of doing that. And that's one of the things we're kind of pioneering in Bristol, in terms of particularly our kind of commercial property sector connections to our heat network, so retrofit buildings, and as well as new developments, and we'll be getting on to the point of doing individual homes, is creating a really clear, easy to use customer journey where people can get their building connected.
What we do is a lot more upstream, so I don't have a lot to comment, but I think just raising awareness as a consumer is first and foremost what you can do, and recognize the power that you have with where you put your own money, really. Be aware of which tariff rate you're on with your utility, go on a renewable energy one, I think is very simple. Buy an EV, like these kinds of things. And just to kind of give a view of where we see the market going with our spot exchange, which is more related to this kind of like demand side flexibility. We think that in the future, you will be aware of what your energy cost is at all times. And maybe you would then run or charge your EV at a certain time where it's cheaper and so on. So I think being aware that this is where the future is headed, then maybe you're already starting to be a bit more aware of when you're using the most energy intensive things in your own home, for example.
Yeah, that visibility is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Stephen?
I'd say there's two different responses if you're acting in isolation or you're acting as a community, because I think too often we just assume that I'm just acting in isolation. I sign up to an energy tariff. I have a price signal that I respond to in isolation. We do have programs and field trials we run on individual homes with National Grid ESO. One called CrowdFlex, one called HeatFlex. Essentially trying to use kind of energy at off-peak hours instead of at peak hours to lessen kind of the pressure onto the grid, because we build for the peak hour. We don't, that's something that we need to build for, and the more you bring that down, then the cheaper and cleaner the energy system is. But it's much more effective to start doing it in communities. And I've been doing a lot of work with the European Commission over the past year of awarding innovation funding, about 77 million to cities around Europe, to look at how they actually start to build these communities. And there's a couple of examples of public-private partnerships, one in Barcelona and in a neighborhood called Viviana, where they're building connecting about 8,000 to a solar network of both self-using the energy and allowing some of it to be exported for recapitalization in the future, so more people can benefit for it, and actually developed a virtual currency that, with another part that benefits people individually. So that starts to kind of get people to build a community. And another example is in Athens. We just awarded money for, if I can pronounce this right, the Polytektrokas. Anyone Greek can correct me on that one, which is a standard bit of housing that they built at 35,000 in Athens in the 1970s. And it's one of those cases of, if you can get the retrofit and renewables right on those apartment blocks once, you can do it thousands and thousands of times and actually start to build communities where action is easy because you can just take something off the shelf that's proven. And that's something which is really difficult to do in the UK because people are kind of paying a lot of money for renovating their buildings in retrofit and renewables onto them that they don't need to, because we need things that come off the shelf that others have done before.
Looking at these communities, though, if I can dig into that a little bit further, how big or small could those be?
Ooh, it depends on how well the people manage them. They could be as small as a building. Like I know a couple of startups that one's called Illume, which has a product called SoulShare, where it could be a building of 8 that they kind of sign up to a collective solar panel that's there, and they kind of put an inverter in and sub-meter it and that sort of thing. Or it could be big as whole neighborhoods. I think I talked about 8,000 homes that was there before, and there's a good question of, once these communities start pushing higher and higher, like how many are going to be included in the energy community? They seem to be landing around that kind of like 8 to 20,000 ish kind of homes area at the largest scale. But those are just the innovation projects we've been funding with the European Commission. So they could, in theory, be much larger.
And Stephen, you've led me on to my next question perfectly, so I'm not sure if you've got sight of my script there, but that is talking about case studies. And you'll learn over the next 2 days, I love case studies, because case studies are things we learn from, because they are examples of things that have gone well, where people have done things differently, and hopefully got some good results. Have any of you got good examples, good case studies, where someone has done something a little bit different to really, I see heads nodding, which is always a good sign, or else you'd all be leaving me hanging here, of where someone has done something a little bit different to push that transition. John, you were nodding first, so I'll come to you first.
I'm always nodding. So, well, in Bristol, we last year we commissioned our what will be our first large-scale water source heat pump. So that's taking heat from the floating harbour in Bristol, so water from the floating harbour, extracting the heat from that in the same way as an air source heat pump would do, but much bigger, and then it transmits that heat into the district heating network. Now that facility has capacity for around 2,500 homes. It currently has a health centre and a fire station and a school and some homes and businesses connected to it. But as we build out across the city, we'll be building more and more of these facilities. And we're currently working with with one of the universities who are building a new site, and they're going to be having it's going to be a centre for quantum computing, and they're going to have a lot of waste heat. And so we're working on a solution for taking that heat into the local district heating network, which will eventually be networked across the whole city. And that heat from those computers will, or those servers rather, will be heating probably around 1,000 homes or equivalent. And you know, some of the work that I'm sure David will be touching on is, you know, how we can think about waste heat, you know, particularly from things like data centers, but from a whole load of other processes that are already ongoing. One of the things that's quite prevalent on the continent is using waste heat from waste incinerators. So once, you know, when you're looking at the waste hierarchy, and as much of the reusable and recyclable product has been taken out of our waste, currently we are incinerating it, which is quite a bit lower carbon than landfill. So it's kind of the best solution we've got at the moment, and that emits a huge amount of waste heat, which in large part isn't captured. So it's generating electricity, but it's not necessarily capturing all the heat. So in our Midlothian project, in our East London project, Corey Riverside, and eventually in Bristol, we'll be capturing waste heat from those recycling facilities.
David?
Yeah, there's a good example. I think it was in Exeter, where there's a fairly new company in the data center industry that does very dense compute, but it containerized. And what they did is they approached the council there, and they've put this containerised solution right next to the municipal swimming pool, and all the waste heat from the high density computing there is being used to heat the swimming pool. And they were really struggling with the cost of energy over the last couple of years of keeping. There was even a chance that they would have to limit the operating hours of that pool, and now they've basically got free heating. And that's caused a bit of a rush, and now lots of councils are approaching these guys for similar things. But waste, from a data centre perspective, waste heat is a key thing, and we've just announced this week we're going to be launching in Berlin, where we're talking to the local council where we're building our campus, how we can reuse that waste heat there, and also potentially for some I think sort of vertical farming, where you can create greenhouses in simple terms close by, where you can pump heat into there to assist with food production.
There's some great ideas. Anything you wanted to particularly add there, Viviana?
So yeah, kind of back more to the pricing aspect in wholesale markets. The biggest development we've seen is going from shorter term hedging and risk management by utilities, which is mainly what they did when they were managing the risk of fossil fuel generated assets, out to 2 or 3 years. Now with PPAs especially, the demand has grown to up to 10 years, where they want to manage the risk and use our products as well to hedge. And so we extended our futures from 6 to 10 years to facilitate that. And the most demand we've had from that, and the biggest success we've seen, is actually in Spain, where the government stopped offering subsidies to new renewable energy assets back in 2017, I believe, notwithstanding all of the other interventions they've done in the past few years. But that has been a great success story for us. And then there's been other interesting developments on the spot side, where an index provider called Speedwell has partnered with our spot exchange EPEX to create indices, essentially replicating capture price. You may have heard of this, which is the actual price that a wind or solar asset achieves on the grid. And this can be the foundation for new products that can also better manage and kind of provide a better fit for risk management products as well.
But as you say, it's so important that it's projects on the ground, like you've just been talking about,
yes,
to further up the chain, if you know what I mean. It's got to be done in all areas to make an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, anything you wanted to add on that?
I think one thing I'll add first is on skills. I think mayors and national governments have really focused on this is an opportunity for green jobs that are out there, and I'm going to cite some work that's been done here in London with the further education budget that's kind of become part of the mayor's work, and I saw it when I worked for the GLA, and I saw it come in. So the Solar Skills London project and the mayor's recovery fund have been like really good about trying to get more renewable installers and others into the system, because it's not something you can outsource to a third country. Like, you have to be doing here, and those are good examples that are there. There's examples of how cities have really trying to work to get renewable energy into their city and have community energy as affordable to others. So, for example, in Zaragoza, they have a project where you pay a €6 a month membership fee for be part of a solar community, and people are getting about up to 30% savings on their energy bills, because they're just getting almost free energy from that community. And so it's a really kind of simple way of leveraging that in there. And more complex ways of building data platforms in Ghent is one example that I've been investigating, where they have about 100 PV sites that they've organized into a virtual power plant. They've been learning from examples such as the Project Symphony project in Perth in Australia. They've been working on doing virtual power plants with residents there for a couple of years now, because they've had an ordinance that said you have to have solar panels or solar thermal inside of in that area for a long time. Just like in Barcelona, they've had a solar thermal ordinance to get 60% of all buildings onto that, which kind of is music to my ears, because I was the only kid in the neighborhood that grew up with solar thermal in small town Virginia, having my mother shout at me that to turn off the shower because it ain't coming back for a few hours afterwards. It was the old style one, I hope. I hope they've improved since then. So there's some examples that are out there. And then finally on finance, the Coach Co-Pro project in Paris has been really kind of trying to match like the skills and the supply chain with building owners that will want to actually try to install renewables and retrofit buildings. And they've levered about 80 million of financing in the last 2 years from that, and really focusing on the willing to pay market that is out there that all cities and governments are trying to tap into and find that, because they can't subsidize the whole thing. They have to have people see the incentives to be able to pay for it.
We will come to the room for questions in just one moment, but I'll do one final question if I can. And we've touched on the importance of government and businesses, but let's look at the role policy and regulation has to play to make this happen, because it is a vital part of the jigsaw. Do we feel there needs to be more regulation or less regulation? Because we've kind of explored it from both ends already today. More or less, or somewhere in between, and we'll sit on the fence. Stephen, I'll start with you on this one.
In the area of cities and the built environment, regulation is driving the market. So, for example, you can see the most amount of investment happening in retrofit and renewables and building stock is happening here in the UK because of MEES and because of the energy efficiency standards that are being put in, saying like you cannot after 2026 rent out an EPC kind of D or worse commercial building, and it might even be 2030 in the future, and that is basically just started at almost fire starter of investment. So for example, just last week, I think I wrote down that that Smith Group kind of had an $80 million acquisition of an HVAC company here in the UK just to get the capacity to serve what they have, and actually it's starting to be more visible to those who have ESG portfolios. This is the ESG conference, yes, isn't it? And thinking that this is something that really proves action rather than the voluntary carbon credit market. And then there's other cities such as New York and Rotterdam. Rotterdam is saying that in 2030, all residential units that do rented out that are E or worse are not going to be rented out in the future. So that's something which is that you're starting to see with more regulation coming in and making the market, because that's what governments do. They make the market.
Viviana, more or less regulation?
We believe overall less, but when it is needed, it should be targeted and it should be really efficient for what the purposes it's trying to achieve. So, for example, in the context of the energy market design reform, which we also consulted on at the EU level, we were happy to see that PPAs can be used with CFDs, for example, so it's a more flexible approach, and it allows, again, for the market to do what it will. We also were happy to see stake-back guarantees for PPAs, because counterparty risk is an issue for PPAs as well. So we believe that is a good way to help the market grow. However, we were obviously not happy to see things like price caps, and that creates a lot of market distortion. It affects market liquidity, which therefore impacts the price development that happens on the exchange. And once you start, not having as much of a robust price signal, that is ultimately a hindrance for the market as well. And not to mention the political risk that also de-incentivizes, in a way, long-term investments like PPAs and things that are necessary for renewables to grow. So on top of that, Acer wants to redesign the electricity market completely, which again creates a lot of uncertainty. So anything that creates uncertainty, we don't think is really necessary. We believe the market is well designed. We can provide robust price signals. It is liquid, and it should be continued to grow.
So yes, if it's targeted, no, if it creates uncertainty.
Exactly. Yeah.
You've answered both sides of the fence without sitting
yeah.
on it. Thank you.
Yeah.
John.
Absolutely agree with that point, and also with Stephen's point around the minimum energy efficiency standards for the built environment, because obviously that drives change massively. But in the district heating space in particular, we're expecting Ofgem to take over regulation of district heating market in the next couple of years, which we welcome. There's not all operators have been have operated networks in the way they ought to, in terms of things like price and bringing down carbon emissions and a range of other things like customer service. And so having Ofgem take the same role as it does in the UK for the gas and electricity markets, but for heat networks is very welcome. I think the other thing, particularly sort of looking back at the Bristol example, is that local planning policy, so this is kind of regulation at a local level, if you like, has been instrumental in enabling the heat network to develop, because it required new developments over a certain size to connect to heat networks if they're available, and that's created a market, and it's created certainty. and enabled a company like Vattenfall to come in, knowing that there will be a market in the future. Now, other cities don't have that policy in place, but what we are expecting to come in from central government in the coming years is heat network zoning. And what that will essentially do is it will look at areas of the city and define zones in which heat networks will operate. And it will then require buildings over a certain size as defined by their heat consumption to connect to a heat network once they're asked to by the local authority. A lot of this is still to be worked out and consulted on, but what that will enable is for other cities that haven't had that spark like Bristol had of that sort of planning policy, it will create that space for the private sector and network operators to come in, invest, and to create that decarbonisation solution for the city.
And David, a quick final word from you before we go to the room.
I'll give you one more C, coordination. I think all of these things that the guys have been mentioning are great examples of how, if the legislation or the regulations are right, it results in better behaviour. But they're all different. They're all focused on building control, or they're focused on the heat network. There's not an overarching strategy there to move it forward. We have a lot of regulation in our sector, which historically has been primarily on reducing the power we consume. But as the products develop, AI being a good example, it's quite power intensive, and I think in that way, a better way to do it would be to look at efficiency regulations, not, in very simple terms, as our business grows, we'll consume more power. That's it, nothing can be done to change that, but how efficiently do we use it, I think is more key.
Okay, let's go to the room quickly. If we have any questions, we have the microphone that's going round. Do I see any hands? Dazzled by that. Oh, we do, just over there.
Thanks. Hugo Lynch from Abel & Cole. I have a question for Viviana about, I think what you were saying about regulation and also forecasts into the future about the time that people will be using their energy. I guess the question is, without regulation, what's to stop there being a massive cash grab into that future? I think, as we've seen with the... people say it's because of the war in Ukraine, the gas prices shot up and they haven't come back down. And also gas is on a lower tariff than electricity at the moment in the UK. So I suppose my question is, without regulation, how can we achieve a green recovery for energy without some kind of oversight from the government in that respect?
Yeah, the issue with that is that you're not only putting a cap on, say, the energy price, which is then passed down to the consumers, you are impacting the price signal as a whole, which is also what is taken in by renewable energy investors. So the energy crisis is ultimately a supply crisis. And if we are to increase supply of renewable energy, we need renewable energy investors to invest in more renewable energy. And when you're doing things like putting a cap on prices for gas, and you're kind of thinking that you can impact the marginal pricing of electricity, this is kind of the wrong way to go about it. You should be doing more things to incentivize the building up out of renewable energy at scale as quickly as possible, which is also being done, but I think this is where the coordination comes in, because then you have these kind of contradictory policies. So this is also what we're trying to raise awareness about. We do a lot of that. We have a big team in Brussels doing exactly this thing. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, it's more difficult for me to comment on the more, say, micro level, because we are really more focused on the wholesale side of things. But maybe Stephen can add if you can. I'm not sure.
So one of the trials that we have going right now, at least in domestic buildings, but you can think about it in the commercial buildings as well, is called Heat Flex, and it's trying to look at people's tolerance towards almost preheating their buildings when renewable energy is available in the early afternoon, and using the envelope of their building, the energy efficiency and insulation of their building, almost as storage for, and are they going to have the right comfort level later on? So you're not just automatically turning on at 5:30 p.m. because if everyone's doing that, once we electrify heat, we basically have the World Cup final times 20 happening then, and that is very expensive to build an electricity network for that, and not palatable to any politician in the future. And so those are the kinds of things we need to start thinking about on top of storage, on top of other things that need to be done at the micro scale to enable this to happen. And also, thinking about how to actually play the lower parts of the wholesale market. So we have a product called Intelligent Octopus that we can say to look at the day-ahead market and say, oh, we have the lowest prices and the most available kind of cheap energy at 2 in the morning. Let's have all kind of cars and batteries charged when that happens at 2 in the morning. Now, of course, once everyone plays this game, it's self-defeating. But but these things do help in trying to manage the local energy system in the future.
Okay, we are on time, more or less, so we are going to have to move on to our next session. But David, John, Viviana, Stephen, thanks ever so much for joining us at Sustainability.
Pleasure.
Thank you.